Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, I'd like you to take a moment to just settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find that comfortable spot, pull the blankets up, and let's let the frantic energy of the modern world just fade away into the background. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time of high walls, heavy crowns, and some truly questionable decision-making. We aren't here for the clashing of swords or the roar of the battlefield. That's far too loud for our purposes. Instead, we're going to look at the quiet, mundane, and occasionally absurd reality of life behind the battlements. We're going to talk about how empires tried to survive when the world outside simply stopped delivering the mail. So, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let's wander together into the long, slow shadows of a besieged city. You see, when we think of a medieval siege, we usually imagine the cinematic version. There are flaming catapult stones, heroic speeches, and perhaps a very dramatic sunset. But in reality, a siege was mostly just a very long, very quiet, and very stressful waiting game. It was less about who had the sharpest sword, and much more about who had the most impressive collection of dried beans. If you were a king or a local lord, your entire legacy didn't rest on your bravery. It rested on your ability to count sacks of grain and manage the waste of 50,000 people who were suddenly and very inconveniently stuck in your house. Let's start with the math, because nothing is more soothing than the logistical nightmares of the 14th century. Imagine you're in a city like Paris or Constantinople. You have your walls, which are very thick and very reassuring, until you realize that those walls also mean nothing is coming in. No carts of bread, no fresh produce, no news from the countryside. Just you, your court, and about 49,000 other people who are all going to want breakfast tomorrow morning. A human being, generally speaking, needs about 2 pounds of food a day to remain somewhat functional. When you multiply that by 50,000, you're looking at 100,000 pounds of food every single day. In a world without refrigeration, without canned goods, and without a particularly firm grasp on germ theory, this was, to put it mildly, a bit of a challenge. The first thing that usually happened when the gates were barred was a very polite, very frantic inventory. The local governor or the king's steward would go from cellar to cellar, counting. And this is where the royal dysfunction usually began. You see, the nobility were quite fond of their luxuries, even while the peasants outside the palace were starting to eye their leather belts with culinary interest. The royal table often remained, well, remarkably festive. There were records of besieged lords insisting on their daily spiced wine and peacocks, because apparently, if you're going to face a slow and agonizing starvation, you might as well do it with a bit of garnish. But back to the beans. Grain was the gold of the medieval world. If you had dry, well-ventilated granaries, you were a god among men. But of course, medieval architecture wasn't always known for its climate control. Dampness was the enemy. If your grain got wet, it sprouted mold. If it sprouted mold, you got ergotism, which, as a brief, drowsy side note, often led to hallucinations and gangrene. So you had a city full of hungry people who were also potentially hallucinating that the walls were melting. It wasn't exactly the recipe for a stable defense. Then there were the animals. When a siege began, any livestock that happened to be inside the walls became the most precious and most doomed residents of the city. Pigs, cows, goats, they all eat too, and they eat a lot more than humans do. Very quickly, the tactical decision would be made. Do we keep the cow for the milk, or do we eat the cow because it's eating the grain we need for the bread? Usually, the cow lost that argument. But it wasn't just about the food. It was about the things we don't like to talk about in history books. Let's drift for a moment toward the topic of sanitation. If you have 50,000 people trapped in a stone circle and they are all eating, or trying to eat, they are also producing a significant amount of waste. In a normal year, this waste was carted out to the fields. In a siege, the waste stays. It stays in the streets, it seeps into the wells, and it waits. This is where the true villain of the siege enters the story. It wasn't the army outside with the trebuchets. It was the humble, tiny, and very persistent flea, and the rat, and the contaminated water. While the king sat in his high tower, perhaps complaining that his wine wasn't chilled enough, the real battle was being fought in the gutters. Consider the case of the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade. It was a mess of epic proportions. You had the Crusaders on the outside who were starving because they hadn't brought enough snacks, and the people on the inside who were starving because they couldn't get to their farms. At one point, the Crusaders were so hungry they were reportedly eating their own leather shields, which, if you think about it, is a very committed way to get your fiber. Meanwhile, inside the city, the leadership was falling apart in that classic petty way that only royals and high-ranking officials can manage. There was constant bickering over who owned which tower and who was responsible for the dwindling supply of horse meat. It's a recurring theme in history. The people at the top are usually the last to realize the pantry is empty, mostly because someone is still bringing them a silver tray with a single, very sad-looking pear on it. And then there's the water. You can live without bread for a while, but you cannot live without water. Most great cities were built over springs or beside rivers, but those rivers could be diverted or poisoned by the enemy. If you were relying on wells and your sanitation system was, let's be generous, informal, then the water became a ticking bomb. Dysentery killed far more soldiers than arrows ever did. It's hard to maintain a dignified royal presence when the entire court is sprinting for the nearest available bucket. But let's move away from the grim reality of the gutters and look at the psychological side of things. Imagine the sheer boredom. A siege could last months, sometimes years, day after day of looking at the same four walls, the same hungry faces, and the same horizon where the enemy army is just sitting there, cooking their dinners, smelling like roasted meat while the wind carries the scent right over your ramparts. It was a form of psychological torture designed by people with a lot of patience. The nobility handled this in various ways. Some turned to religion, others turned to incredibly elaborate games of chess, and some just leaned into the absurdity. There are stories of besieged cities throwing their last remaining food over the walls to the enemy, literally tossing bread at the soldiers outside, just to trick them into thinking they had so much food they didn't know what to do with it. Oh, this is just our extra brioche. We have heaps of it. No need to worry about us. It was the medieval version of fake it till you make it, though it rarely actually worked. Eventually, the hunger would reach the palace. This is where we see the fragile bloodlines of Europe start to show their cracks. The pampered children of kings, who had been raised on almond milk and fine flour, were suddenly faced with the same reality as the blacksmith's son. Their delicate constitutions didn't fare well. You see a lot of the sickly prince or the frail princess in these accounts, which is really just a polite way of saying they were malnourished because their parents had spent the defense budget on a new set of tapestries. There's a certain irony in it all. The very walls built to protect the elite became their cages. The gold in the treasury became useless because you can't eat a ducat. And as the weeks turned into months, the social hierarchy, so rigid and absolute, began to liquefy. A man with a hidden stash of salted herring became more powerful than a duke with a 1,000-year-old pedigree. As we drift further into the night, let's think about the end of these sieges. They rarely ended with a glorious charge. They ended with a quiet conversation. A surrender signed with a shaking hand because the scribe was too weak to hold the pen. The gates would creak open and the world would rush back in. Fresh air, fresh water, and the crushing realization that all that suffering was usually over a bit of land that the king's cousin felt he had a vague ancestral right to. It's all very exhausting, isn't it? The sheer effort of human stubbornness.
But for now, you don't have to worry about the grain supplies or the state of the wells. You are safe, you are warm, and your pantry is presumably well stocked. The walls around you are just walls, not fortifications. Let's leave the dusty, hungry streets of the medieval city behind for a moment. Let the sounds of the distant campfires fade. We're going to move on now, drifting away from the smell of old stone and damp grain toward another corner of history, one populated by people who were perhaps a bit too related for their own good. Next, we'll look at a different kind of confinement. Not the confinement of a city wall, but the confinement of a family tree that looks more like a telephone pole. Now that we've left the starving city walls behind, let's drift towards something a bit more scenic. Imagine, if you will, the rolling green hills of the English countryside in the mid-1700s. It's a very curated.
You see, if you were a duke or a high-ranking earl in the 18th century, your garden was your social media profile. It told the world who you were. And at the time, the trend was melancholy. It was very fashionable to be seen as a person of deep, brooding thought. But it's quite hard to look brooding when you're hosting a garden party with 300 people and a mountain of lemon cakes. The solution, naturally, was to hire someone to do the brooding for you. Think of it as a living lawn ornament, a bearded, silent influencer whose only job was to look like he was contemplating the fleeting nature of existence while you and your friends had tea nearby. The logistics of this were, as always, delightfully absurd. If you had a large estate, you would build a hermitage. Now, this wasn't a cozy cottage. No, that would be too comfortable. It had to be a folly, a structure made of rough stones, perhaps some damp moss, and maybe a few strategically placed goat skulls for atmosphere. Once the cave was ready, you needed an occupant. You would place an advertisement in the local paper looking for a man willing to live in your garden and act like a professional recluse. The contracts for these positions were remarkably detailed because even in the 1700s, people loved a good non-disclosure agreement. A typical contract might stipulate that the hermit must stay on the grounds for 7 years. During that time, he was forbidden from cutting his hair, trimming his beard, or clipping his fingernails. He was often required to wear a robe of camel hair, and, most importantly, he was never, ever allowed to speak to the guests. He was essentially a human statue, designed to give the garden a vibe of ancient mystery. And what did the hermit get in return? Well, usually a modest salary, free meals, often delivered in a wooden bowl by a silent servant, and the sheer luxury of never having to participate in Georgian society. For some, this sounded like a dream job. For others, it was a descent into a very specific kind of madness. Take, for example, the hermit hired by the Honorable Charles Hamilton at his estate Painshill Park. Hamilton was very serious about his melancholy. He built a magnificent stone hermitage and found a man willing to inhabit it for £700, a fortune at the... You see, if you were a duke or a high-ranking earl in the 18th century, your garden was your social media profile. It told the world who you were. And at the time, the trend was melancholy. It was very fashionable to be seen as a person of deep, brooding thought. But it's quite hard to look brooding when you're hosting a garden party with 300 people and a mountain of lemon cakes. The solution, naturally, was to hire someone to do the brooding for you. Think of it as a living lawn ornament, a bearded, silent influencer whose only job was to look like he was contemplating the fleeting nature of existence while you and your friends had tea nearby. The logistics of this were, as always, delightfully absurd. If you had a large estate, you would build a hermitage. Now, this wasn't a cozy cottage. No, that would be too comfortable. It had to be a folly, a structure made of rough stones, perhaps some damp moss, and maybe a few strategically placed goat skulls for atmosphere. Once the cave was ready, you needed an occupant.
You would place an advertisement in the local paper looking for a man willing to live in your garden and act like a professional recluse. The contracts for these positions were remarkably detailed because even in the 1700s, people loved a good non-disclosure agreement. A typical contract might stipulate that the hermit must stay on the grounds for 7 years. During that time, he was forbidden from cutting his hair, trimming his beard, or clipping his fingernails. He was often required to wear a robe of camel hair, and, most importantly, he was never, ever allowed to speak to the guests. He was essentially a human statue designed to give the garden a vibe of ancient mystery. And what did the hermit get in return? Well, usually a modest salary, free meals, often delivered in a wooden bowl by a silent servant, and the sheer luxury of never having to participate in Georgian society. For some, this sounded like a dream job. For others, it was a descent into a very specific kind of madness. Take, for example, the hermit hired by the Honorable Charles Hamilton at his estate Painshill Park. Hamilton was very serious about his melancholy. He built a magnificent stone hermitage and found a man willing to inhabit it for £700, a fortune at the time. The rules were simple. The hermit had to stay for 7 years, never leave the grounds, and never speak. He lasted exactly 3 weeks. Apparently, the aesthetic of loneliness is much more enjoyable when you're not the one actually sitting in a damp cave while it rains. He was discovered at a local pub, presumably having decided that a pint of ale was worth more than a lifetime of ornamental brooding. But why were the elites so obsessed with this? It's because the Enlightenment was a very noisy, very intellectual time. Everything was being categorized, measured, and mechanized. There was a growing fear that humanity was losing its connection to the wild. The ornamental hermit was a way for a wealthy landowner to buy a piece of the wild and keep it in a controlled environment. It was the 18th century version of buying a very expensive, very rustic-looking candle that smells like a campfire. It's the idea of the wilderness without the inconvenience of actually getting mud on your silk stockings. There was a quiet, sardonic irony in the fact that these hermits were often watched by the public. Estate owners would open their gardens to visitors, and one of the main attractions was spotting the hermit. People would tiptoe up to the cave, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bearded man reading a book or staring at a skull. If he looked sufficiently miserable, the host was considered a person of great taste. If the hermit looked too comfortable, or, heaven forbid, was caught napping, the whole illusion was ruined. It was a performance of poverty by the extremely rich. While the actual poor were being pushed off their land by enclosure acts, the wealthy were paying people to pretend to be poor in their backyards. It's the kind of social dynamic that makes you want to lie down in a darkened room, which is luckily what we are doing right now. As the years went on, the trend eventually faded. People realized that maintaining a human being in a cave was a bit of a logistical headache. Hermits had a tendency to get sick or bored, or most inconveniently, they would start talking to the guests and ruin the mystic silence. Eventually, the living hermits were replaced by wooden cutouts, and then by nothing at all. The caves became empty shells, and the fashion moved on to something else, probably something involving even more lace and even less common sense. But just imagine being that hermit for a moment, sitting there in your camel hair robe, watching the elite of England wander past your cave. You see the powdered wigs, the absurdly wide dresses, the petty dramas of the court played out on the grass, and you just sit there. You are the only person in the garden who isn't performing, and yet your entire existence is a performance. It's a strange, quiet way to live. Let's drift away from the damp caves of England now. Let the sound of the wind through the manicured trees fade into a soft hum. We're moving towards something even silenter and perhaps a bit more unsettling. Think about the world before the light bulb, before the steam engine, before the constant low-frequency buzz of the modern age. We are going to step into the great silence, the world as it sounded before we forgot what quiet really meant.
Now, I'd like you to take another deep breath. Feel the weight of your limbs. We've wandered through starving cities and stared at hermits in damp caves, but now I want us to listen. Or rather, I want us to imagine the absence of sound. We live in a world that is never truly quiet. Even now, as you lie there is the hum of a refrigerator, the distant whine of a car on a highway, the buzz of electricity in the walls. We're surrounded by a constant mechanical drone that we've learned to tune out. But if we were to step back to, say, 1820, the first thing you would notice, the thing that might actually unsettle you, is the silence. It wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a different kind of atmospheric pressure. Before 1850, the world was unplugged. There were no internal combustion engines, no sirens, no airplanes cutting through the clouds. If you stood in a field in the middle of the night, the only things you would hear were the things that had been there for millennia: the wind, the rustle of grass, and the occasional owl. It was a silence so profound that it was said you could hear a wagon coming from miles away, the wooden wheels creaking against the dirt like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the earth itself. But don't let the word silence fool you into thinking it was peaceful. In the cities, the soundscape wasn't quiet. It was just different. It was organic. It was the sound of muscle and bone. Imagine London in 1840. There are no rubber tires. Every carriage, every cart, every hansom cab has wheels rimmed with iron. And the streets? They aren't smooth asphalt. They're cobblestones. Imagine the sound of thousands of iron-shod horses and iron-rimmed wheels striking stone all day long. It wasn't a hum, it was a clatter. A sharp, metallic, bone-shaking rattle that echoed off the brick walls. It was so loud, in fact, that wealthy people would sometimes pay to have straw spread over the street in front of their houses if someone was ill, just to muffle the sound of the passing world. And then there were the people. Because there were no loudspeakers or televisions, if you wanted to sell something, you had to scream. Every street had its own cries. The oyster sellers, the coal men, the chimney sweeps, they each had their own melodic or not-so-melodic shout. It was a human cacophony. A city sounded like a massive, uncoordinated choir of desperate commerce. But when the sun went down, the world fell off a cliff. Today we have light pollution, but we also have sound pollution. In the 1800s, when the shops closed and the candles were snuffed out, the world became terrifyingly still. If you were a royal living in a palace like Versailles or Windsor, the nights were long and heavy. Without the background hum of the modern world, every floorboard creak sounded like a gunshot. Every whisper behind a tapestry carried. It's no wonder the elites of history were so paranoid. They lived in a world where you could actually hear someone breathing on the other side of a door. There was also the sound of industry, which was far more rhythmic than it is now. Before the steady white noise roar of modern factories, you had the thump, thump, thump of water wheels and the rhythmic strike of hammers on anvils. It was a percussive world. Everything had a beat. If you lived near a smithy or a mill, your life was dictated by a mechanical pulse that stopped when the sun set. And let's talk about the bells. In the pre-industrial world, bells were the masters of time. Without everyone having a glowing rectangle in their pocket, the church bell was the only shared reality. It told you when to wake, when to pray, when to mourn, and when the fire was spreading. The sound of a great bell was felt in the chest as much as it was heard in the ears. It was the voice of the community, and in the great silence, a bell could be heard for 10 miles. There's a certain sardonic beauty in thinking about how we've traded that clarity for convenience.
We've filled the world with a gray noise that never stops. We've lost the absolute sounds, the sound of a single bird half a mile away, or the sound of the rain hitting the leaves before it hits the ground. In those days, your ears were your primary warning system. Today, we rely on our eyes for almost everything, but back then, you navigated the world through sound. You knew who was coming by the rhythm of their horse's gait. You knew the weather by the way the wind whistled through the eaves. You were dialed into the frequency of the planet in a way that is almost impossible for us to comprehend now. As you drift deeper into your own silence, try to imagine that world. No hum, no buzz, just the soft, natural world waiting for the morning. The dark wasn't just a lack of light. It was a heavy velvet quiet that wrapped around the houses of kings and peasants alike. It leveled the playing field. In the dark, in the silence, a king was just as vulnerable and just as small as anyone else. Let that quiet settle over you now. Feel the stillness of the room. We're going to leave the silent streets of the 19th century and move towards our final destination. We're drifting towards the vast, wind-stepped steppes of Central Asia, the heart of the Silk Road. Usually, when we think of this place, we think of Marco Polo or Genghis Khan. We think of dusty men on tired horses, carrying silk and spices across thousands of miles of desert. It's a very male-centric, very rugged image. But there's a secret to the Silk Road that history often whispers, but rarely shouts. While the men were away, often for years at a time, the greatest empire in the world was being run by women. You see, the Mongol and Central Asian empires weren't built like the European ones. They were mobile, they were fluid, and because the men were constantly engaged in the masculine pursuits of conquest or long-distance trade, the entire administrative, economic, and logistical backbone of the empire fell to the women. These weren't just wives waiting at home. They were the CEOs of the medieval world. Imagine a royal camp or a ger. It isn't just a tent, it's a moving capital city. When the Khan was off on a campaign, his senior wife, the Khatun, was the one in charge of thousands of people. She managed the movement of the herds, which were the actual wealth of the empire, and she presided over the courts of law. If a foreign diplomat arrived, he didn't wait for the Khan to return from the border. He knelt before the Khatun. There's a delicious irony in the journals of European travelers from this time. They would arrive from places like France or Italy, where women were often treated as decorative property, and they would be absolutely scandalized to find Mongolian women driving massive ox carts, negotiating trade prices, and drinking fermented mare's milk while discussing plate armor. One traveler noted with a sort of stunned, sardonic confusion that the women seemed to do all the work, while the men just rode around and looked important, which, if we're being honest, sounds like a fairly accurate description of a lot of history. Take, for instance, the daughters of Genghis Khan. While his father was busy becoming a household name for all the wrong reasons, he strategically married his daughters off to the kings of nearby nations. But there was a catch, because with the Mongols, there was always a catch. He would require the new son-in-law to send his other wives away and join the Mongol wars. Predictably, many of these son-in-laws didn't make it back. This left the daughters in sole command of strategic kingdoms guarding the Silk Road. They were the shield of the steppe. They managed the flow of silk, silver, and tea. They kept the road safe. Without their administrative genius, the Silk Road would have been nothing more than a series of disconnected, dangerous paths. They were the ones who turned a trail into a global economy. And then there were the petty royal meltdowns, because no empire is complete without them. Even in these powerful lineages, you had the spoiled princes, men who had been raised in the shadow of legendary mothers and grandmothers, and naturally grew up to be remarkably useless.
We see records of these queens having to essentially ground their grown sons, taking away their horses or their seals of office because they were making poor financial decisions or bickering over who had the larger silk tent. It's a recurring theme in our journey tonight. The people we remember are often the ones who made the loudest noise, but the people who kept the world functioning were the ones in the shadows. The women of the Silk Road didn't need their names on every coin. They had the keys to the treasury and the loyalty of the army. They were the ones who made sure that when the men finally returned from their important travels, there was actually an empire left to come home to. As we reach the end of our travels, I want you to feel that same sense of quiet stability. The Silk Road is quiet now. The great camps have vanished into the dust. The iron-rimmed wheels of London have stopped clattering. The hermits have left their caves, and the besieged cities have long since opened their gates. The past is a noisy place if you look at the headlines,